Triumph and tragedy. A narrow river runs between hills covered with green and golden grass and thick woods along the Little Bighorn. Unceded territory. Northern Great Plains, 1868. Hundreds of buffalo plod across a grassy plain. Dust rises as one buffalo rolls on its back, then stands.
It is the last great expanse of land not under the control of the United States government. By the 1860s, most native tribes have succumbed to reservations. But Indians the Americans refer to as Sioux defiantly cling to their traditional way of life.
A Sioux warrior rides a horse beside the galloping herd.
For decades, their culture has revolved around the now declining herds of buffalo.
An animated map of the northern plains.
The Sioux domain stretches across the northern plains, from east of the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming Territory. They consist of three primary tribal groups: the Dakota, the Nakota, and the Lakota.
Joseph Marshall III, Lakota historian.
The population of the Lakota probably was nearing 20,000. That made us one of the largest tribes in that region of the country. We were a force to be reckoned with, if nothing else.
A black and white photograph of teepees.
Allied with the Lakota are upwards of 1,000 northern Cheyenne, who also roam the northern plains. They are joined by bands of southern Cheyenne, who are facing encroachment on their homelands in Colorado, Kansas, and present-day Oklahoma.
More historical photographs. Steve Brady, Northern Cheyenne.
The Northern Cheyenne were defending their way of life, their hunting lands, because they were so connected to the buffalo. It was now under a serious threat.
A black and white photograph of New York, 1870.
The U.S. population is 35 million and growing every day.
More photos. Denver, 1860. San Francisco, 1870.
The government is under intense pressure to open up Lakota and Cheyenne lands for settlement.
Ernie LaPointe, great-grandson of Sitting Bull.
And they were trying to acquire land that nobody should own. You belong to the land does not belong to anybody. And this was in our culture, is how you care for the land, take care of it, live upon it, and move on.
An antelope steps through tall grass. A handwritten document.
The Treaty of 1868, signed at Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory, creates the Great Sioux Reservation, far away from major transportation routes leading west.
On the animated map, the Union Pacific Railway runs south of the Great Sioux Reservation.
The reservation takes up the western half of present-day South Dakota. It includes the Lakota's sacred Black Hills.
If any place defines the Lakota, it's the Black Hills.
A narrow stream runs through a green field.
It was the center of their physical world.
Twin waterfalls cascade at the edge of a clearing. A herd of deer stands in a field.
And because of that, there were creation stories that emerged about the Black Hills and the Lakota.
But in the Black Hills and on the rest of the Great Sioux Reservation, the buffalo have already disappeared.
My ancestors realized that this resource was probably not going to come back in the numbers that it once had. So it started with hunger, and it ended up with fear and uncertainty.
The map.
Article 11 of the 1868 treaty stipulates that the Lakotas may leave the reservation and hunt the last of the great buffalo herds in a vast but loosely defined area called unceded territory.
To the west of the reservation.
The Lakotas were indeed in their treaty rights to occupy parts of the unceded territory.
Jerome Green, historian. A list of signatures.
But some of the people who were not party to the 1868 treaty, who had not signed that accord, continued to live in that area and decided not to go on the reservation. And these people became the major bone of contention with the U.S. government.
Photos of Cheyenne men on horseback.
Cheyenne leaders like Lame White Man and ICE refused to sign the Treaty of 1868, or for that matter, any treaty. So do Lakota leaders Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull.
A photo of stern-faced Sitting Bull with long, dark braids.
Sitting Bull, he was a medicine man, a spiritual person, a traditional healer. And Crazy Horse was probably at the time the best-known military leader. They were saying no to submitting to the authority of white America.
Dark clouds hang over the rolling Black Hills.
Just 6 years after the Treaty of 1868 comes the flashpoint that ignites a chain of events that will lead to the Little Bighorn. In 1874, just a year after a banking collapse had sent the economy tumbling, there are rumors of gold in the Black Hills. By treaty, the Black Hills are indisputably part of the Great Sioux Reservation.
A photo of columns of covered wagons.
To lead an expedition into the Black Hills, the government looks to George Armstrong Custer, a Civil War hero, now Lieutenant Colonel of the 7th Cavalry.
Several photos of wavy-haired Custer with a bushy mustache.
George Armstrong Custer is one of the best-known soldiers in the American Army.
Paul Hutton, historian.
And he emerged from the Civil War as a golden cavalier, the young, bright star of the American Army.
The dark, jagged Black Hills.
In the summer of 1874, Custer confirms what many already know. There is gold in the Black Hills. Miners ignore the treaty. With the economy in a deep depression, the U.S. government does little to stop the stampede.
A vast green plain stretches toward distant mountains.
1875. The U.S. government attempts to buy the Black Hills. Lakota leaders refuse to sell. Many reservation Indians now leave to join Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who continue living their traditional ways in the unceded territory.
A photo of Sitting Bull.
Sitting Bull just wanted to be left alone. He wanted to live on the land as his ancient ancestors did before him. And that was all he wanted.
In an old photo, soldiers stand in formation.
The Lakota had been a thorn in the side of the United States for well over a generation. And finally, by 1875, with their refusal to sell the Black Hills, there is general agreement within the government that they have to be swept aside.
5 trees stand on a fog-enshrouded hill. December 1st, 1875.
In the dead of winter, the United States gives those in the unceded territory an ultimatum. Report to the reservation by January 31st, 1876, or be branded hostile.
A bald eagle sits in a tree.
The ultimatum is ignored.
Soldiers on horseback.
The U.S. government begins a campaign to force the Lakota and Cheyenne onto their reservations. It is the beginning of the Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877.
The strategy was to field 3 columns of troops
On the map, moving arrows.
coming at the region from the south, from the west, and from the east.
Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer marches with the 7th Cavalry in the eastern column. Allied with the U.S. military are Indian scouts from the Crow and Arikara tribes. In the push for westward expansion, the Lakota have nearly annihilated the Arikara. And now Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are encroaching on lands by treaty belonging to the Crow.
Marvin Dawes, Park Ranger, Crow.
The last chief of the Crow planning crews said it very well when he said that it wasn't because we love the white people why we sided for them. It was because we wanted to keep our lands.
Children run beside an encampment of teepees.
In the spring of 1876, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull are joined by many who refuse to accept life on the reservation.
Dandelions grow in a field of tall grass.
The growing Lakota and Cheyenne village travels through the unceded territory. In late June, rumor of a large antelope herd leads them to a river the Crow call the Little Bighorn.
The river flowing past thick woods.
At that point, most of people realized that their way of life was over.
Photos of various Native Americans.
Either we accepted their control or fight and die. Warriors were quite willing to fight and die. That's what they were bred to be, to fight defend, to die on behalf of their people.
Sitting on horseback under a full moon, a native warrior holds a long spear. He glances over his shoulder. The sun rises into an orange sky. June 25th, 1876.
Early on the morning of June 25th, Custer's Crow and Arikara scouts discover a large village on the Little Bighorn. Soon after, Lakota scouts spot the 7th Cavalry. Custer fears he will be attacked. Even more concerning is that the Lakota and Cheyenne will escape. Custer believes his best chance is to attack. He divides his command. Captain Frederick Benteen is to move southwest to prevent the Indians from escaping. Custer then orders Major Marcus Reno and 140 men to cross the Little Bighorn, advance down the valley, and engage the Indians. Custer tells Reno he will be supported.
A Native American man rides through an encampment of teepees.
One of the Cheyenne in the village is Antelope Woman.
Women and children went to hide in the brush. War ponies were brought into the camp from the herds, and the warriors mounted them and galloped away.
Horses holding soldiers riding several abreast gallop across a field. They stop.
Instead of charging the village, Reno's cavalry dismount and form a skirmish line.
The real threat was that the soldiers coming right into the camp.
A native man grabs a rifle.
Children, grandchildren, wives, mothers, aunts, grandparents, all those things were in imminent danger.
The soldiers and natives exchange gunfire.
Reno's outnumbered men quickly pushed back into timber along the Little Bighorn.
As the soldiers retreat, Native Americans shooting arrows and guns advance. Smoke obscures the fleeing soldiers. One native man carries an arrow in his mouth. As one soldier mounts his horse, he falls to the ground. Other soldiers gallop off.
Reno orders a retreat across the Little Bighorn to the bluffs overlooking the river.
It just becomes virtually every man for himself. Ride for your life.
A soldier lies motionless, a long arrow sticking out of his chest. Jerry Jasmer, park ranger.
Reno does not seem to be in command of the situation. He's probably wondering in his head, what is Custer up to?
A mustached soldier wearing a red bandana looks around himself. A 3D map.
Custer, along with 209 men, has already advanced to the high ground to the east. He pauses on the bluffs overlooking the Little Bighorn, where he sees the Indian village for the first time. Custer then descends into ravines leading to the river. A possible plan: send one column across the river at Medicine Tail Coulee. While these soldiers attack, Custer moves north to flank the Indian village. One theory is that Custer, as he did at Washita, plans to capture women and children fleeing Reno's initial attack. Holding them as hostages, Custer would then end the battle and force the Indians back to the reservation.
Ken Woody, Chief of Interpretation.
All the warriors leave Major Reno's initial attack, and they come down to this new fight. Custer's now no longer the attacker, he's being attacked.
One imminent threat was the enemy was going to come into your camp and harm, kill, maim your family, your children, your grandparents. You're willing to do what it takes to defend them, to make sure that that enemy doesn't get into this camp.
Fighting and dying with Custer are Indian scouts, civilian personnel, and more than 200 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry.
Photos of several soldiers who died in 1876.
The 7th Cavalry is very much a representation of the America of the late 19th century, with the Germans, the Italians, the Irish that make up the regiment, farm boys from the Midwest, soldiers of fortune from around the world.
More photos of young soldiers who died.
All of them seeking their future in the West, in the land of opportunity. None of them, of course, could ever dream that all of their dreams, all their hopes, all their aspirations would come to an end in what had to have been sheer terror as finally those ranks collapsed and it was every man for himself.
A photo of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, 1839 to 1876. Native Americans run across the field. One throws a tomahawk at a fleeing soldier, striking him in the back.
For Custer's command, the Little Bighorn becomes a battle of attrition.
A soldier fires a rifle. A native man shoots an arrow. On the 3D map, 2 red arrows move west.
The column at Medicine Tail Coulee is repulsed at the Little Bighorn and moves up towards Battle Ridge.
A white arrow moves northwest.
North of the village, Custer is overwhelmed by warriors. He retreats to what is today called Last Stand Hill.
Under dark clouds, Native Americans run up a grassy hill. A soldier plants an American flag. A native warrior fires an arrow.
Another story that my grandfather talked about was, he got kind of teary-eyed when he was talking about this. He observed one soldier. He said he got off his horse and took out his sidearm. He shot this horse in the head. And the horse fell down, he says, and he used it as a barricade. And he said that man knew that he will never see the sunset.
A mustached soldier aims his revolver.
He said this is his last act of survival.
In a photo, Custer wears a brimmed hat and uniform.
He must have thought he could win almost to the very end. But then finally, even Custer must have understood that they were doomed and that he was making a last stand.
Dead soldiers, arrows sticking out of their backs, lie near a fluttering American flag.
There had to be a moment when most of those warriors realized they're all dead. That here was this